Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Will. The phrase lost in translation is both literal and figurative, but sometimes not accidental. Which is why, in today's video, we're gonna go over the differences between the English and Japanese versions of the Sonic X anime. Let's get to it!
If you're like me and grew up watching Sonic X in English, then I'm pretty sure that you would remember how Sonic and his friends used to crack jokes every other second, Eggman's robots kept on blasting each other with lasers, and the cast of characters seemed extra sober because, apparently, they never even took a sip of alcohol. As in this universe, nobody drinks anything stronger than a soda. When I first saw this show's name after years, the first thing I remembered was the dialogue that unmistakably had that early 2000s Saturday morning cartoon rhythm, breezy and harmless, where every conflict was resolved by a quip. Now here comes the neat part once you watch the original version. In the Japanese version, the lasers Eggman's robots are shooting? Bullets. The sodas that everyone drinks all the time. Champagne and wine. In fact, you can notice that the adults who are pouring them are visibly a little tipsy too. Oh, and the vague government thing that keeps showing up in the plot actually has a name, which has been said out loud constantly in dialogue and shown on the sides of vehicles. It's called GUN, a real military organization central to the story, especially once you get into Shadow's backstory. 4Kids, the one responsible for making these small changes, did not just trim out this stuff. They completely replaced it and rewrote it in such a way that entire scenes and dialogues completely changed their meanings. Mostly it was done to avoid certain content that the censor board deemed a little inappropriate, and sometimes they did it just so that a joke could land better. In today's video, we'll be talking about how different the real Japanese Sonic X is from the version most of us actually grew up with, and hopefully figure out how different this kid's show was from the actual story. So grab a bucket of popcorn, and while you're doing that, hit the like button too, and get strapped in, cause your childhood is gonna change forever. Every gunshot in the show became a laser blast. In the Japanese version of Sonic X, the sound of a gun firing is a gun firing. It's literally the default sound of combat for them. Eggman's robots, gun soldiers, and human forces all fire weapons that sound like real bullets, constantly, across the whole series, through and through. Now, in the English version, as we discussed before, nearly every single one of those gunshots was replaced with this kind of sci-fi laser or blaster noise. But thankfully, the animation remained untouched. I personally think they just thought it was way too much work because there were guns shooting in almost every single episode. But this caused the show to end up with a mismatch where we could see that firearms were going off everywhere, but our ears were indirectly telling us that the weapons these people were shooting were not just normal guns, but some sort of space weapon. As we can already see, 4Kids rarely bothered altering the visuals themselves. They just replaced the audio, which means anyone paying close attention could tell something did not line up. This change in the gunshot sound was probably the most recurring change in the entire show, because any episode that has even a little bit of fighting has this audio cue replaced. Naturally, even if only by a little, it shifts how dangerous the world feels, even though nothing on screen actually changed. The show's entire drinking culture got rewritten into a diner. In the Japanese version, adult characters drink wine, champagne, and beer on screen fairly regularly, with reporters getting visibly tipsy at parties, and at least one bartender running an actual bar stocked with clearly visible liquor bottles. It's quite realistic, and honestly shows Japanese drinking culture in a pretty fair light. The problem was that 4Kids did not want children to get influenced by all of this. So their solution was to recolor the wine and champagne so they looked like orange juice. And when that didn't work in certain cases, they decided to digitally replace entire liquor bottles with soda dispensers and food stands. Seems like a pretty good idea, right? Well, they weren't done with it, because they even rewrote all the drinking dialogue and turned it into eating dialogue instead, just to be safe. The clearest example of this change is a full bar scene that gets turned into what looks like a fast food counter, right down to the bartender's hat being changed into a fry cook's cap. Honestly, it was quite a bit of effort, I can totally understand why they got lazy with the gunfire noises. Plus, the best part was that, unlike other shows that do a few touch-ups to change the problematic entities, 4Kids went all the way and made sure they changed a pretty recurring place in the show, and also the adult context that came with it, turning grown-up spaces into something that looks like it belongs on a kid's menu. Damn, hell, and worse quietly disappeared from nearly every episode. In the Japanese version, characters across the whole cast, including Sonic, Knuckles, Tails, and Eggman, casually drop words like damn and hell as ordinary speech, not as some shocking moment played up for effect. Honestly, this is the type of dialogue that people barely even register, you know? In fact, it's quite natural for the people in the show to talk like this because when they're annoyed, stressed, or in the middle of a freaking crisis, and nobody ever comments on it because, as I said, this is just normal for the people in those situations. In the dub though, the story is quite different, as almost every one of these lines is handled in one of three ways. Either they are muted entirely, swapped for a grunt or a sound effect, or if the line is kind of crucial to the plot, but not those specific words, it's rewritten into a totally different sentence with a totally different tone behind it. Let me give you the best example of this from the show, because it comes from none other than our favorite Echidna guardian, Knuckles. In the Japanese version, Knuckles is seen saying, "Damn, what's up with everybody?" Which 4Kids changed to, "Great, what will I do now?" in English. And the thing is, they didn't just soften the tone of the sentence or make it a bit lighter, they quite literally changed the entire meaning and tone of the entire sentence, which also affected Knuckles' in-scene attitude. Because this kind of swap happens so consistently and so often across almost every single episode, what ends up happening is that we get a cast that sounds noticeably calmer, tamer, and less frustrated across the whole series than they were actually written to be. Now, it depends on whether you think it's a good change or an unnecessary one. Gun. The actual name of a military organization got erased from its own show. In the original series, GUN stands for Guardian Units of Nations. It's a fully named military organization that plays a central role in multiple story arcs, including the entire backstory behind my favorite character from this entire show, Shadow the Hedgehog. This entire GUN organization is not like a side character's side character either. It's a real, repeatedly referenced piece of the plot that has been talked about and discussed throughout the entire show in numerous episodes through dialogue, and its symbol has also been shown on many vehicles and even buildings. They're like Team Rocket from Pokemon, but for Sonic. If GUN is such a big deal, you would think that there's no way they will be changed or written off, right? Well, in the English dub, the word gun gets digitally removed from a huge number of scenes, sometimes replaced with vague phrasing like official government operation instead of naming the organization directly at all. Literally, the biggest organization in the entire show got mogged by 4Kids. The most surprising part is that this entire thing was not even a one-time fix. They didn't just remove it from like 1 or 2 episodes. As we know, the word gun shows up in so many episodes, literally dozens. So editing it out meant that the people working on it had to manually make these changes for all the episodes. Boy, I'm sure it took a lot of manpower and money, and the most likely reasoning behind this change is probably that they wanted to avoid the word gun so that kids watching the show did not get to see the word, regardless of the context. This ended up creating one of the stranger and more persistent censorship threads in the entire series, precisely because the organization's name was baked so deeply into the plot itself. This specific change is actually a pretty rare case, where the censorship happened because of a specific word showing up on screen instead of the literal context. Real violence got trimmed, muted, or cut outright. Even the small stuff. See, the thing about Sonic X is that it is, after all, about a super hedgehog. So, like in any other action cartoon, violence has to be there, even if it isn't full of gore. And Sonic X definitely tries to make us feel like there are not many fights in the series, minus the big, huge fights, but in reality, plenty are small enough that most casual viewers probably never notice them at all. In the Japanese version, there is a scene of police officers actually shooting at Chaos, with bullets visibly striking him and falling to the ground afterward, and that entire scene is cut from the dub outright. Like, completely cut out, as if it never friggin' existed. Not gonna lie, I was really bummed out by this because I love action scenes, and this one would have been badass. There was another scene like this involving Rouge, where she had a small cut on her face after Knuckles punched her. And the thing is, this scene was barely a second long. The worst part of it all is that this is not just visual cuts either, because sound gets censored too, with screams and pained reactions during fight scenes, including Sonic getting repeatedly hit by Chaos's tentacles muted in the dub, even when the actual footage of the attack stays exactly the same. Like, why? I know I must give it to them because the violent censorship from their side also functions on so many different levels, like visual cuts, sound removal, and dialogue changes, which were often stacked together. But the thing is, if it were one or two small changes, nobody would care. But if you deep dive into every single piece that was ever deleted or replaced, you would end up realizing that the fights in Japanese held so much depth and action than the English version ever did. Rouge's flirting got rewritten into something almost unrecognizable. The funny thing about Sonic X's Rouge is that Rouge the Bat in the original version actually has a very flirtatious personality, where her dialogue is very openly flirtatious while occasionally leaning into innuendo. And even her design had a very minute little detail that was later digitally removed once the show was ready to be broadcast. In the original version, her entire personality was built around confidence and seduction, and it was always treated like it was part of who she was rather than something taboo or shocking. In the dub though, woof. Would you believe me if I said that entire lines were cut out and replaced by something else, which ended up making the entire scene have a completely different tone? One clear example is a kind of famous line that goes like this: "I'm the beautiful girl who was kidnapped, and you're the old lady who kidnapped me." Which turns into, yeah, I know, so I've heard, but all I want is a cup of coffee. Don't be such a nag, in English. This new version does not sound at all like a toned down version of the first joke. This new line instead sounds like an entirely different joke told by an entirely different person. Honestly, this kind of censorship happens pretty often, so it's a good example to understand the exact pattern this censorship followed, because this censorship was not about removing content, but more about replacing content with a new and different type of material that was never a part of the original, which ends up changing the context in a few ways, and it's also definitely a stranger and more involved method of editing than just a simple cut. The end result is a Rouge who reads as generically sassy in English rather than the more overtly seductive character Japanese audiences actually got. Entire lines were rewritten with different meanings, and not just softer ones. In many cartoons, a lot of the script changes in the English dub are not censorship of anything questionable at all. In reality, they're just different dialogue serving a different joke or a different tone entirely, which suggests that the writers behind the show were working on a much broader rewrite that was constantly happening on top of the original rather than a defensive edit made to avoid content. One of the biggest examples of such censorship comes from one of Eggman's lines, where he says, "This is why I hate anime. He would normally be dead." This was an amazing meta joke and a fun nod to the fact that the show we keep calling a cartoon was actually an anime. In the English dub, they completely removed this joke instead of softening it, changing it straight to, "How can that hedgehog survive the egg beam cannonball?" See how it just ruins the entire Easter egg? Another similar thing happened with Chris's grandfather's dialogue about being drunk. "Do I look like I'm feeling good because I had too much to drink?" This becomes unrelated dialogue about having fun, with no mention of drinking at all, changing the entire context of the moment. Many people understood these changes as 4Kids protecting kids from being influenced by TV shows, but there are some jokes that needed no changes, and honestly, it was maybe not worth the change in my opinion. They were actively rewriting jokes and character voices throughout the series, line by line, episode after episode. Sonic himself got a different personality in English. When I was watching the Japanese dub before starting my work on this video, I had no idea about this, but once I realized it, let's just say I was a little less than happy, but also glad, because there were some changes that made me like him even more. If I had to make a direct comparison between the two versions, I would always end up at the same conclusion. Sonic's dub dialogue leans much more heavily into wisecracking one-liners and a cockier, quipier delivery than his original Japanese dialogue ever does, which adds up to a genuinely different character voice rather than just a translated version of the same one. There are quite a few scenes where Sonic reacts to something with real concern or at times with plainer, grounded dialogue in the Japanese version. But instead of keeping this serious tone, the English version actually sneaks in a joke or makes a boastful comment just to elevate the viewer's mood, and that is truly a great touch for a character with almost no flaws. One useful reference point here is the comeback scene, a rare case where subtitled Japanese audio is lined up directly against the English dub for the same footage, making the personality gap easy to hear side by side rather than just describe. The good thing about all of this is that this change in Sonic's personality doesn't just appear once or twice. It's a continuous thing that has been constantly done over 3 entire seasons. So Sonic, as an English-speaking character, ends up feeling much more meaningful and like a different personality than the simpler, plainer version that the Japanese version had. The English Sonic is not the same hedgehog who just got translated. He's a totally different Sonic with his own personality traits that immediately stands out, and honestly, it's much more likable than the original version. Cosmo's death was rewritten and handled very differently on US Air. We all know Cosmo. We all love her character. She is literally one of the major characters introduced during the Metarex arc, and while the season was still going on, she was killed off near the end after asking Tails to fire the weapon that ended up killing both her and the season's main antagonist. Not only was it a genuinely dark, deliberate self-sacrifice played for real emotional weight in the Japanese version, but it was also one of the greatest sacrifice scenes in this entire show. The English counterpart of the show knew this scene could be devastating to many kids, so they reframed and retimed several scenes as they softened some of the emotional bluntness while also trying to keep the core beat intact. In the English version, Cosmo still asks Tails to fire, and she still ends up dying, so this edit was much more restrained than the other ones we have talked about so far, including the full rewrites. The bigger story here, though, is not the editing or the censorship. It's actually how they decided to broadcast the episode. This episode actually became known among English-speaking fans for its unusual scheduling and handling around its original US air date. It literally stood out as one of the few moments where the actual content, a main character's death, became the central point of concern rather than a specific line or a specific shot. While rewatching, I understood why they took this approach, and honestly, it was probably the right thing to do because, remember, many characters were very different for us than they were for Japanese viewers, so the entire aspect surrounding Cosmo's death could have caused very different reactions if they had done it in the exact same way. The entire soundtrack was replaced, and some songs got erased everywhere. Are you even surprised at this point? Usually many cartoon shows do end up changing their original songs to something else when it comes to dubbing. So 4Kids decided to replace Sonic X's original Japanese background score with an entirely new soundtrack for the English dub. Thankfully, it was a standard move across most 4Kids productions of that era rather than something unique to the show, so they knew what they were going for. There were many instances where several Japanese insert songs were replaced with generic rock music when it came to major important scenes, which ended up changing the entire emotional texture of key sequences, like major reveals or even the races. What is actually strange is that a few years later, the original Japanese songs were pulled from the show due to some licensing issues on major platforms like Netflix and Crunchyroll, meaning that if you even wanted to watch the uncut and real version of the show, you might not be able to hear them anyway. Honestly, I kept this fact for last because I thought it was a perfect note to end things on. We had never watched the original version of Sonic X, and now that it has slowly lost so many pieces of itself, there is a high chance that the real version we might want to watch is no longer the real version itself, but instead just a shell of its former self that may never be recovered again. After this long journey, I'm sure you went through a lot of emotions. Nostalgia, anger, sadness, and probably a few more. But one thing is clear to all of us. Sonic X in English isn't just a cleaned up version of the Japanese show. In a lot of ways, it's a different script performed over the exact same animation. Now, some of you might blame 4Kids for this, but let's be honest, all of this was standard practice back then, And even though I was personally not a big fan of a few changes, there were other things that were more than enough to keep me invested. Honestly, if I didn't know that there was a Japanese version of Sonic X out there, I would probably have no complaints at all. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, smash the subscribe button, and ring the bell icon so that you never miss another update from us. Oh, and before we go, comment down below which anime or show we should cover in our next videos. Till we meet again in another video filled with excitement and drama. See ya soon!